Jennifer asked me to kind of lay the foundation, the groundwork for what we're going to talk about today. So I'm excited to be here to talk about taking sex and gender into account in healthcare and research. And as you can tell, I'll be speaking in English, and I will try to speak slow, though I have a tendency to speak quickly. So I will try to speak slowly, especially since I know that this is not necessarily everybody's first language. Again, my name is Kristen Springer, and I am going to go ahead and start. So what I'm going to talk about today, the overview of what I'm going to talk about is what is the current medical perspective on sex, gender, and health? What are some problems with this biological sex difference perspective? And then I'm going to move in how do we do this better? How do we better study and improve health? And I'm going to talk about the importance of integrating biology in the social environment. No surprise to all of you, what I mean is the integration of sex and gender and really taking gender seriously. So first, we're going to start out with the current medical perspective. So what we see here, we see a nursing home, many more women than men, right? We know that women live longer than men do. We know this is one of the kind of premier ways of seeing gender differences or sex differences, male-female differences in health. So this and is another way of looking at it. This is life expectancy at birth in 2015. So we have the open triangles are, open diamonds are women. The closed circles are men. And this is life expectancy again at birth. So you have 68 years to 88 years. These are OECD countries. France is in red, right? So the point I want you, the point I want you to get, right, is that across the board, women outlive men, right? So this is a clear male-female difference in an important health indicator. I think we would all agree that dying is bad health. So I'm going to put this up here as an example, and that we'll talk about through the presentation. But it's not just life expectancy. There are many, many, many articles and many ways that we talk about male-female differences in health. So we see here more than 10,000 articles. This was in 2012. More than 10,000 articles deal with sex gender differences in clinical medicine, epidemiology, et cetera, et cetera. So this focus on looking at male-female differences is very strong and very pervasive. So this, I think, captures the lay and scientific primary perspective on how we think about men and women in general and men and women's health. So you can see here, and I'll go through each of them a little bit, you can see that we characterize men and women as distinct, as completely different, and as biologically non-overlapping. So kind of the lay perspective up here, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. The classic guide to understanding the opposite sex. We're binaries, we're opposites, right? Or Time magazine, a little bit less of a trade publication, why men and women's brains work differently. It's all about the wiring. So here we see we have men and women positioned as absolutely differently, alluding to the biological foundations. It's all about the neurological wiring. And then I think the most compelling example of the medical perspective on male-female difference in health is in this review article in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm sure you all know, but this is the premier medical journal. Notice it's in the current concepts title, right? It's in a current concept saying this is the current way of thinking about it by Daniel Fetterman, who is a Harvard physician. And we have the biology of human sex differences. And I'm going to read this and point out some interesting parts about it. So it says here, everyone in medicine and related fields understands there are marked sex-based differences in the epidemiology, clinical manifestation, course, and therapy of disease. Although few of these differences are understood in molecular or cellular terms, the explanations must derive from the fundamental biological differences between the sexes. So kind of to unpack that a little bit, notice what we're saying here is that everybody, right, everyone in medicine and related fields knows that there are marked sex-based differences between men and women in health. And we don't know why there are, but they must derive from the biological differences between sex and gender, or between males and females. So notice in terms of a scientific perspective, it's not very scientifically grounded to say we obviously know there are these differences. We don't understand why, but we know it must be because of biology, right? So this is kind of the basic premise that underlines the main way that male-female differences in health are now presented. But what's the problem with this? Why is this not good science? What are some issues with this perspective? So I'm going to talk about 3 issues with this perspective before I move on to talk about a better way to do this. So 1, Men and women are not biologically distinct, right? This idea that we're going to look at male-female differences as biologically distinct and the root cause being these biological differences assumes that men and women are biologically distinct. So some silly little pictures, right? So one way people talk about, well, men are taller than women, for sure. But is that biologically distinct? Can you separate men and women specifically by height? Right, so you see here you have your two bell curves. There's plenty of overlap, right? You can't separate men and women as biologically distinct. There's plenty of overlap in terms of height. And also, you notice if you're looking only for male-female differences, you miss a lot of variation within men and within women, right? So you see this is a beautiful example of you have very different physique in terms of height and in terms of body size within men as well. You miss those differences when you're looking just between men and women. Okay, but what about reproductive differences? You'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't say that there are reproductive differences between men and women, right? Everybody will come back to this as saying, okay, well, obviously there are male and female distinctions between reproductive differences, of course. But we also know, right, that there are a number of people who are intersex that have ambiguous characteristics that don't line up with the stereotypical kind of ideal type of what male and female physiology is. Does anyone have a guess of what this number is? I'm sure many of you know here, but do we have a sense? Right, because if it's really rare, we might say we don't need to worry about it, right? 1 in a million, it doesn't matter. 2%. So even in what we think of as the most fundamental, distinctly biologically different characteristics that make men and women biologically distinct, there's a whole decent amount of overlap, right? 2 out of 100 don't have the biological characteristics that line up completely with what we would expect to be male physiology and female physiology. So again, the take home is men and women are not biologically distinct. Another problem with this perspective of looking at biological sex differences and assuming biological sex differences is it's not really good science. If we look for sex differences, we find them. And I'm going to give you one example of this, and we can talk more about this later in the discussion if you want. So there was a study by Patsopoulos in JAMA, again, a very well-respected medical magazine, medical published journal, talking about claims of sex difference, an empirical assessment in genetic associations. So what the authors did here is they searched PubMed journals for genetic association studies that claimed sex-related difference. So they looked at 432 health-related sex difference claims in published articles. So this is important to remember. These are published, peer-reviewed articles that have gone through a peer review process that are published, and these are articles that have specifically claimed a sex difference. Okay, so they're published, peer-reviewed, specifically claimed a sex difference. Oops. Okay. So they did a variety of things in this article, but one thing I'm going to talk about is they examined whether these sex differences were appropriately tested or documented. And by this, they did a variety of things. They looked at whether they had the same genetic contrast. If you're going to look at male and female in terms of the genetic predictors of health, you need to be looking at the same genetic marker or the same set of genes. So they looked at that. They looked at whether they were comparing the same subset of men and women. It's not good science to look at old men and compare them to young women, right? You have to have the same subset or the same whole group of men and women. This is just good science, right? This is nothing mind-blowing. This is good science. And they looked at whether or not they reported or showed the intersection, the interaction term between genetics and sex, right? So all of these things you would expect to be present in peer-reviewed, published journal articles showing and claiming a sex difference in genetic effects. I'm guessing you know the punchline, right? Okay. Ooh, sorry. So less than 13% met those criteria. Less than 13% tested the sex differences in genetics affecting health in an appropriate scientific way. What does that mean? For this talk, what this means is that because we assume there are biological sex differences, because we assume that there are biological differences that shape men and women's health differently, we don't set those hypotheses to the same sort of standard that we would other hypotheses. If we find a difference between men and women, we assume it must be true, and it's not set to the same criteria that other differences would be. It also means we have a lot of false positives. That means 87% of these might be false. And I don't have time to talk about all of it now, but I will tell you that there was a subset of these articles where they were able to reanalyze the data, and the vast majority of those that they could reanalyze, they could not reproduce. So again, the point is if we have this assumption of biological distinctness between men and women, it allows these processes of publishing these supposed biological differences to go through smoothly without actually testing them in a rigorous scientific way, which leads us to poor science. Okay, so the third reason why this sex difference, biological essentialist sex different approach, is not good science is that sex is not a mechanism. So you notice a sex difference. What does that tell you? How does that help improve anybody's health? So again, this figure that I'm going to show you a couple more times, you notice this, right? Now what? How does that help improve anybody's health? We don't have a way of if you just notice a sex difference or a health difference between men and women, how do we do anything about that? How does that improve anyone's health? Sex is not a mechanism, right? So if we're interested in improving health, and I think most of us here are, we need to understand how these differences come about and how we can intervene. Okay, so now we get to what do we do about it? How do we better study this? Again, the same figure. Okay, so how might we better study this if the way that we've talked about it is not the case? So we saw this in the video that they presented earlier, manhood is enacted in part through risky health behaviors that can lead to early mortality, right? This is gender. We're going to talk about this. This is gender. And in the video we saw this as well, that manhood is enacted in such ways that can cause men to die earlier, to have higher rates of health problems. I've done some of this work. My other colleagues have done some of this work. So we know this is an important way that these gender differences, these male-female differences in health happen. Or in a more comical way of talking about it. So BuzzFeed is a funny news source in the United States. And so they had an article that was perfect for this presentation, 25 completely scientific reasons why women live longer than men. So again, going back to the mortality chart that I showed you. Okay, so these were some of the images that were associated with this BuzzFeed article. Right, so you see here, we have this man on a ladder precariously over stairs painting. I don't know what, and I still don't ever understand what's going on in this image over here. Riding a bicycle over another man lying on flames. You know, the helmet part, the no helmet is the least of our worries in this. But the point of this is these ideas of what it takes to be masculine and macho and to live up to these ideal types of manhood can lead to higher health problems, higher risks of early mortality, et cetera. So we need to take into account these gendered ideas that affect health outcomes. I'm gonna check my time. And research is showing that we might actually be closing this gap that's been persistent for a very, very, very long time, this mortality gap between men and women. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States says that men are living longer and will close the life expectancy gap with women in around 25 years, according to this research. Who is interested in health wouldn't be interested in how to do that, right? Wouldn't we all want to take the pill or do whatever we could do to make that happen? So what is it? What is it that we think is closing this gap? Gender, essentially. Looking at gender, not biology, but looking at gendered factors that is closing this gap. Right, so what scholars have pointed to, the ideas of masculinity, right? So men, one of the main things is that men are smoking less. They are accidents, suicides, and alcohol use. It's largely attributed to smoking. But to the degree that we're cutting down on these kind of masculine typed behaviors, we're gonna reduce men's mortality rates. We're gonna equalize men and women's mortality life expectancy. There's also less, one other important aspect in the literature is that men feel like they should not go to the doctor because it goes against their kind of masculinity beliefs. I've done work on this, other people have as well. We're seeing less of that happening, it's still there, but the idea is that that's going to happen less and less, therefore closing the mortality gap. There have also been some great policy interventions reducing occupational health risks in men's jobs. Men's jobs being jobs that are stereotypically designed for or assumed to be occupied by men, that men are the ones who are more likely to go into, that are these male type jobs. So read up here, the top three, you can say gender, right? Not biology, gender, right? These are the factors that are leading to closing this mortality gap. It's also interesting to think about though, this is not just improvements in men's health, right? women are experiencing more of these masculine stressors as well, right? So the point I want to make is this slide that I've put up all along about the gap in mortality. We're now predicting that it may close, and the reasons why it may close have to do with gender, not to do with biological differences. Okay, so what I've talked about up till now is really thinking about gender as something in some ways separate from sex, right? So we have men kind of acting in this masculine way. We've talked about these different factors and how that might affect life expectancy, but it's also important to think about sex and gender as intertwined, as something that you can't separate. Biology and social environment is ways that are completely integrated. And so in work that I've done with other people, we talk about sex, and other people have done this, we did not come up with this, but that sex and gender is a complex phenomenon that is simultaneously biological and social. You can't separate them. You can't think about them as separate things. And in this sense, you need to theorize them, model them, and assume that they're integrated until proven otherwise. And I'm going to give you one example of this before I close. So we're going to be hearing more about osteoporosis and bone health later today, so this will just be a preview. But it's a beautiful way of showing this entanglement. So in terms of France, just so you know, of the estimated 3.5 million people with osteoporosis in France in 2010, over 80% are women. Clear male-female difference, right? And this is biological. This is bone health. This is very physical and very biological. And you can see here the normal bone is very dense. The osteoporotic bone is very weak and not as strong. And a lot of this difference has been attributed to women's estrogen decrease after menopause. So a lot of this difference has been attributed to biological differences between men and women. But scholars will argue, and hopefully I'll show you one example of this, and this is from Anne Fausto Sterling, who, if you haven't read her, you need to. She's amazing. So she argues you cannot easily separate bone biology from the experiences of individuals growing, living, and dying in particular cultures and historical periods under different regimes of social gender. So what she's saying here is you cannot think about bone biology without understanding how gender in the specific historical time, specific social context might affect bone biology. Okay, let's flesh that out. What does that mean? So I have two pictures here, right? So what are these pictures of? On the left, a picture of a woman in high heels. Right? So we know women wear high heels in part because of the cultural ideas of femininity, cultural ideas of beauty, right? That is not good for women's bones, right? It's not good for osteoporosis. It increases the risk of joint problems. It sets your spine in a way that leads to higher rates of osteoporosis. It increases your risk of falls. Gender affects bones on this left side here. What do we see on the right side? No sun, right? So here we have a woman in a burqa in the water, right? So the gendered social norms, gendered social rules require that she cover up in the sun, right? Not for lack of wanting to be outside, not for lack of wanting to enjoy the sun, but because gendered cultural rules require that she be covered up. What does that have to do with osteoporosis? Vitamin D absorption is necessary for calcium absorption, right? So here, and there have been studies that have shown this, she is increasing her chance of having weaker bones because of these gendered social norms, these gendered social rules that lead her to be covered up. Right, so here you see gender is actually affecting bones. Gender is affecting bone differences. One of the causes, one way that you see osteoporosis, you see these male-female differences in osteoporosis are because of these gendered ideas. So just an example to bring it home. That gender actually shapes biology. I think it's important just to get a visual that you have gender actually shaping bones, gender actually shaping bodies. So I just want to wrap up with the title of the conference, so Sex and Gender in Health and Innovative Articulation. I want to just reiterate that the standard sex difference research is based on faulty assumptions, like we talked about, of male-female biological distinctness. And it's limited or even harmful, right? It's not going to get us what we need to get us. And it could be harmful in the sense that we have false positives, not useful. And hopefully it's clear, right? Improving the health of real people requires looking at their real lives, right? Looking at gender. Gender is a part of someone's real life. We need to look at that. And hopefully I've also shown that gender shapes biology. Just because you see a biological health outcome does not mean that there's a biological cause at the core. It could be a gendered social cause that affects that biological outcome. It's an important distinction to make. And then finally, I just want to make a plea towards, while we're thinking about gender and sex, and we're thinking about really incorporating the social environment, gender does not exist outside of other social factors, right? And so the burqa is a perfect example of that. You can't understand what's going on with this woman in the burqa without also paying attention to culture, race, class, other factors. So I would encourage us all, and as the next step, to think about intersectionality and how these factors combine together. So thank you very much.